The next summer intern who we had the pleasure of working with this year was Catherine Matthey. Catherine Matthey has her doctorate in political science, and her research was on end-of-life issues, particularly on issues related to assisted suicide or medical assistance in dying. And in particular, she worked on two aspects of that. One is, what's the impact of COVID-19 and assisted suicide? How are they meshing together? What the impact has been. And secondly, the federal government has been proposing Bill C-7 to amend, to expand the provision of assisted suicide in Canada. Catherine Matthey, we thank you very much for your research in this area. And our executive assistant to the board, Zoe Stewart-Bedard, will be presenting the research tonight in summary form because Catherine Matthey wasn't able to do it tonight. And we thank her again for her research. And Zoe, thank you for giving us the summary of that right now.
Hello, everyone, and thank you. My presentation is going to be in two parts tonight. The first is going to focus on the correlation between MAiD, which is medical assistance in dying, and COVID-19. And the second portion is going to be about Bill C-7. So I'm going to get the PowerPoint going and then we can start. All right. So I think we can all agree that seniors around the country have had their lives changed by restrictions designed to mitigate the COVID-19 spread. In June, the Canadian Institute for Health Information revealed that COVID-19 had taken the lives of over 5,000 residents of long-term care homes, and that's 81% of all lives lost in Canada due to the pandemic up to that point. This is a grim statistic. But, oh, it seems that my PowerPoint is not up. Okay, well, I will keep going audio and try the PowerPoint again while I go. So even though that is a grim statistic, the fuller impact of the pandemic on these residents is a lot harder to quantify. It is mind-boggling to think about those who have remained free of the disease and may still be suffering greatly from the loneliness and isolation that the enhanced precautions from lockdowns and all the changes that have happened over the last couple months have brought on them. There is a great risk that this kind of suffering will lead many who were previously content with their lives to consider MAiD for the first time as a means to escape their current circumstances. The first annual report on MAiD was released in 2019, and it revealed that 13.9% of people who died of COVID, 13.7% of people who died by MAiD in 2019 described that the reason for their application was isolation or loneliness. And Canada's experience with the COVID-19 pandemic has brought to light the devastating and sometimes fatal conditions that many vulnerable Canadians face in long-term care homes. If Canada does not have a system in place to ensure that the conditions for those living in long-term care meet at least some acceptable standard, we're going to see a devastating spike in MAiD applications following this COVID pandemic. More light was shed on how COVID-19 is making euthanasia a more accessible option in a webinar hosted by the euthanasia advocacy group, Dying with Dignity, where several MAiD practitioners discussed their firsthand experience of providing MAiD during the pandemic. Shockingly, during this pandemic, when families and friends and volunteers have been shut out of long-term care homes, providers of MAiD are free to enter. And as one provider stated, I was allowed into every home. The federal statistics needed to demonstrate whether MAiD requests or deaths have risen due to the impact of COVID-19 will not be available until next year. This graph from Health Canada's annual report on MAiD from 2019 shows a steady increase in MAiD since legalization. From this graph, we can reasonably anticipate that a further increase can be expected, but the exact extent cannot be known until these statistics are made available. Given all of the current available evidence that isolation and economic restrictions and limits to medical access are driving up the number of MAiD requests, the need for greater detail is crucial now. It will be most unfortunate if the red flags are missed that might save lives today. And this need only becomes recognized retroactively when the pandemic's impact on MAiD has become too large to miss. Now we're going to move into the second portion of my presentation, which is focused on Bill C-7. Earlier this month, the federal government reintroduced Bill C-7, which had been left on the table when Parliament prorogued due to the COVID-19 pandemic. And this bill was first introduced in February to vastly expand Canada's MAiD policies. In this part of the presentation, I'm going to briefly summarize the current laws concerning MAiD and the main changes that are being put forward in Bill C-7. In 2016, Canadian Parliament passed a bill that, in the most basic terms, allowed a medical professional to aid a person to die by suicide if certain qualifications were met. There are 4 criteria to be eligible, and they are that you must have a serious illness, be in an advanced state of decline, be experiencing suffering that is intolerable, and natural death must be reasonably foreseeable. Following a Quebec court ruling in 2019 that claimed that the current laws are unconstitutional due to the limitation that the individual must have a death that is reasonably foreseeable, the federal government crafted this Bill C-7 to broaden the MAiD laws. Bill C-7 proposes several changes, but we're just going to focus on 3 of the most significant ones. The first is MAiD for those who are not dying. Arguably, this is the biggest proposed change, and it would mean that a person who suffers from an irremediable medical condition could qualify for MAiD regardless of whether these conditions are expected to be fatal. Disability groups have strongly opposed this extension of MAiD eligibility. They explain that the role of the reasonably foreseeable natural death requirement is to protect against disability being a reason to terminate life. Removing the qualification would allow a disability to serve as a justification potentially for ending a life. The second major change is made by advance consent. And this would be through a prior written arrangement for those whose death is reasonably foreseeable in certain circumstances. The government's readiness to take this particular step appears to be premised upon its belief that a person who is facing natural death and wants MAiD enough to proceed with the formal steps to secure it will not experience a change of heart about his or her decision. However, this confidence is in error, according to evidence that the government itself has provided in its first annual report on MAiD from 2019, where it states that 3.6% of the patients who made written requests for MAiD subsequently withdrew them. Now, I know that that is a small fraction, but it's not a small number of people. It ends up equaling over 260 Canadians that year alone who completed written requests for MAiD and then later chose not to go through with them. A parliamentary report discusses the potential societal costs of allowing advance requests, and some believe that advance requests could harm, and I quote, the way society values people with capacity loss, increasing the belief that it is acceptable to consider a life with capacity loss as one not worth living. Or even, quote, create a society in which MAiD was an appropriate alternative to providing quality and accessible care. The next proposed major change is that there will be no more waiting period. Under the current law, there is a mandatory 10-day period between the request and execution of MAiD. However, Bill C-7 proposes to remove this waiting period altogether. And this also, you can also pull on what we've just talked about with individuals then withdrawing their requests for MAiD. And it means that individuals who might have reconsidered, if given the time to reflect on their decision, may ultimately receive MAiD against their wishes. So what do we do now? What can we do to help if we feel so inclined? The federal government has until December 18th to pass the bill through the House of Commons and the Senate. If the proposed changes upset you and you want to be heard, the best course of action is to contact your local member of parliament or sign a petition against Bill C-7. If you want more information about Bill C-7 or about the correlation between MAiD requests and the COVID-19 pandemic, or if you'd like a copy of Catherine Matthey's research, please don't hesitate to contact the deVeber Institute. Thank you.
Very much, Zoe Stewart-Bedard and Catherine Matthey for the original research. One of the things that we always hear from those involved in palliative care, and we've had many presentations, the deVeber Institute over the years on palliative care, has been the small minority of Canadians that actually live in an area where palliative care is widely available or even available at all. And the dichotomy of providing assisted suicide nationwide, including even in prisons and long-term care facilities when no one else was allowed in, and not having palliative care available coast to coast to coast, is something that has long concerned certainly palliative care advocates and practitioners, but really all of us may be in the position of needing palliative care at some time. And it is, I think, bears repeating that if palliative care is widely available, fear of end of life difficulties are often abated and a more peaceful resolution can be followed up than is the case with assisted suicide. So thank you very, very much, Zoe Stewart-Bedard, for that presentation.